I've noticed this trend of people blaming individuals for either using generative AI or for how they use it. And what I'm going to talk about today is not about malicious actors. It's not about people doing prompt injections. It's not about, people who are doing deep fakes and stealing people's identities and just, wrecking havoc right now. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about students using ChatGPT to write essays. Shame on them. People turning to AI companions. Oh, how sad, how pathetic, right? Workers automating their emails. Oh my gosh, they're cheating the system. Why are they so efficient? Why are they, doing this thing? And it releases a sort of um anger sometimes and a certain level of disgust. And I was just about to go on a philosophical tangent on modes of disgust. But let me stay on course so I don't make this 3 hours long. Um, but here's what I think we're missing. Um, Generative AI didn't create these problems; it exposed them, and I believe there's a huge difference between those two things, and we're gonna get into it today. If you're new here, I'm Shay. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard, and this is Critical Thinking in the Age of AI, just a repository for my thinking on AI, the humanities, and the future of work. And we just think deeply together. Listen to this like you would a voice note. Respond, comment wherever you're listening, and let's engage in dialogue. I believe learning happens socially, and you need to be making sure your mind is constantly engaging with other people, not just chatbots. And that's something we're gonna really get into today and talking about what these chatbots are systemically showing us, right? Okay, so look, I'm someone who loves getting to the root of problems, right? I love systemic analysis. And I think mostly it's because before ChatGPT even existed, we already had massive structural issues that were setting people up for exactly the kind of behavior that is being criticized, right? So let me actually like paint the picture. So before generative AI even came about, right? Attention spans were already declining. Hello, social media and other addictive technologies. The average reading level, at least in the U.S., was already dropping. People were reading less and less for pleasure or leisure than ever before. We already have a loneliness epidemic. Students were already exhausted by the cost of higher education. Come on, somebody, and the meritocratic environments that they were in, right? So none of that is new, and none of that was caused by AI, right? And I say this. Hold on now. I say this as someone who lived through it. Like I have so many degrees. I went to some of the best schools in the world. And guess what? It nearly crushed me in my 20s. I had this, total coming to Jesus moment where I was just like, what is all this boss lady lean in Sheryl Sandberg stuff actually worth? Like, come on. Like, if you grew up during the lean in generation where they were just handing those out and, during graduation, like it was free candy. That book was in everyone's hands, right? And it really just led me to lose my ambition. I was a very ambitious person, especially in my early 20s. And by my yeah, I would say by my late 20s, I just really started to question, and I had sort of like a purpose crisis is what I would call it, where my identity was tied to my job title and the work I was doing. And I've written quite a lot about this on my newsletter about losing my ambition and the journey to recovering it in a healthy and sustainable way, which you can find on my newsletter. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is, I get it, and look at me now. Here I am talking to you on this podcast about critical thinking and intellectual health and not climbing some corporate ladder or even optimizing my productivity to the umpteenth degree. I understand how these systems work and what they do to people. And I think that's why I'm trying to highlight what I'm about to highlight. Okay. So here's why I think it's so important to focus on systemic issues more than we do on individual blame. I'm not saying individual actions don't matter. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I think more so when we put too much shame and blame on individuals, you know, when we don't look at the wider structures at play, we inadvertently create fatalism. And fatalism is the thing I'm actually most worried about, because I don't want people to think like, oh, there's nothing I can do. I don't have any agency. I don't have any power. There's no point in trying. Like, I absolutely hate that mindset. Um, and you do not have to think like that, you know? But in many ways, individual blame creates exactly that response, right? If the problem is just that people are morally weak or lazy, then what's the solution? Be better, try harder. That's not actionable when the incentives are broken, you know? So instead, when we look at systemic issues, we can actually see what needs to change, right? Yes, individual actions matter, but collective change is often what we're working towards. We can identify the broken incentives. We can redesign the structures that govern our lives. And I always argue we're in this very interesting transition period to the AI driven economy. And while this window is open, we have a perhaps once in a generation or once in a lifetime opportunity to actually reshape and redesign some, long term institutional structural issues, right? And I don't want us to waste it. Okay. So let's talk about what incentives generative AI actually exposed, right? So let's start with social media. No big surprise here, right? Um, First of all, I don't think we were ever really meant to make like short, snappy, hook-based content designed to hijack people's attention, right? We weren't meant to write like that. We weren't meant to talk like that. We weren't meant to create videos like that. We weren't meant to capture people the way social media platforms require. That's a platform incentive, not a human need. Um, so why are we surprised that people are using generative AI to game a system that we, as human beings, were never really meant to engage in to begin with, right? Like the amount of the reward structure. Let me say it like this: the reward structure of social media is, the more you put out, the more addictive it is, the more you can capture people's attention, the more you can post, it'll reward you. And I think a lot of these incentives were never good for our brains in the first place. And I think now AI is making that obvious. Like, let's be honest, a lot of people don't like being glued to their phones. They don't like having to spend, 7 hours editing a shorts that's only going to be viewed for 3 seconds by, a certain amount of people, depending on how the algorithm feels that day. Like, you know what I mean? Like, our lives are being formed and shaped by a specific platform. No one desires to do that. Like, we always have to remember that there are some, expert psychologists that design these systems so that you can give as much of your time and attention to it, right? You didn't decide that. You are in many ways a guinea pig of very powerful psychology. Okay. Um, let's talk about education. So here's actually the big one. We started rewarding the product instead of the process. And I believe when you do that, you actually incentivize people to take shortcuts. You incentivize students to do things that look good but are intellectually hollow, that don't have any real substance to them. We told students, look, your grade is everything. GPA is king. You need it to get a job. And now we're shocked. Shocked. We are so shocked that students are trying to get to that end goal as efficiently as possible. But that's the higher education system that we built. We created those incentives. And then we act surprised when people respond to them by using generative AI tools, right? Like, you care more about the final essay than the first 4 or 5 drafts and the process it took to actually use their brains and to think critically and deeply about what they're writing, right? When only the final product gets graded, when only the final product is incentivized, uh, that they'll take the shortest route to that because we're not rewarding the process of thinking. We're rewarding the final product. Okay, let's talk about mental health. So, look, this is something that, I have friends who work in the health tech space, and these are very difficult conversations that we've had, right? Because in many ways, we've made therapy inaccessible. When it costs 150 to 200, in some cases $250 a session, and insurance doesn't cover it. Are we really shocked that people are turning to AI therapy bots that cost $20 a month? In some cases are free. When we've destroyed third spaces, when there's nowhere for people to gather and to build real in-person communities, are we shocked they're turning to AI companions? The loneliness epidemic didn't start with ChatGPT. It was already here. AI is just filling a void that we created, right? Um, I think the same thing goes with emails and workplace communication, right? So the first wave of the internet gave us all of this admin. Come on. Short form messages, constant notifications, Slack, digital distractions we didn't have before. And now people want to use AI to remove those distractions, to clear out the admin, all in the name of efficiency. And we're acting like that's a moral failing. No, I think this is what I'm arguing, that it's a rational response to a system that drowned us in low value tasks, that takes us away from the meaningful, deep work, a la Cal Newport, that we were actually designed to do. So are you seeing the pattern here that I'm trying to outline? In every case, we built systems with, fraught incentives, platforms that reward engagement over truth, education that rewards grades over the process of learning and thinking and making mistakes, healthcare that makes connection unaffordable, work cultures that value speed over depth, right? And then we're surprised when people start to game those systems, right? We're surprised when they use AI to optimize for what we told them as a society that created these structures mattered. So the problem isn't the individual making those choices. That's what I'm arguing. The problem is that we built structures where those are the rational choices to make. Okay? So when we focus on individual blame, I think we miss all of this, We say, "Oh, students are cheating with AI." We don't say, we built an educational system that made GPAs more important than intellectual curiosity. So students rationally optimize for GPA. We say, "Oh, people are replacing real relationships with AI." But we don't say we destroyed the social infrastructure that made real relationships accessible and affordable. You know, we say, "Oh, workers are being lazy by using AI." Oh, really? But we don't say we created workplace cultures that drown people in admin and reward speed over thoughtfulness, right? So individual blame sometimes lets, these systems I'm describing off the hook. It makes the problem about, personal virtue instead of structural design. And I think worse, I think it creates the fatalism again. Like, that's a big one for me. I don't like people feeling or believing like they don't have agency or power because it's just not true, you know? And I'm not saying that people aren't truly, misusing and abusing. I think it's more so when, the average person is using generative AI. There's always this, once again, moral judgment that's placed on people. Um, And I think when we sort of obscure ourselves from these larger systemic issues, we then place more accountability on the individual who will be crushed under the weight of that accountability than we do on the institutions and the systems and the corporations and the larger factors at play that created the conditions under which the individual now has to operate, right? So here's how I think we should understand generative AI and all of this. I think it's revealing the cracks in a system we built, right? It's making visible the perverse incentives, the bad incentives, the how do I like the fraud? Yeah, I like that word I used earlier. The fraud incentives we've been ignoring for decades because we could still pretend they weren't that bad, But now it's just becoming undeniable because of how AI is being used, right? And when students can essentially generate, entire essays instantly, we can't keep pretending that essay writing is actually about learning. You know, we have to admit that it became about credentializing, right? Focusing mostly on the final product than the process of getting there. And even look, when it comes to AI companions, when people form attachments to AI companions, we can't keep pretending our social infrastructure is fine. We have to admit, we've made human connection scarce and even more expensive. We are also living in a cost of living crisis around the world. You know, um, AI isn't creating these problems, it's showing us what was already there. So what do we do with this? First, once again, I refuse to accept fatalism. You have agency, obviously not unlimited agency. You're still operating within structures and systems, but you have choices about how you engage. Um, Second, I would say at the individual level, you can choose differently, right? You can prioritize process over product in your own work. You can ask why before how, right? You can protect time for deep thinking, even when the incentives push you toward speed. Because I think those choices matter long term, they change what's possible for you. Um, and they model alternatives for others, right? Like, once again, I'm not saying, individuals don't matter and what they do don't matter. Uh, but I want us to not just, name and blame and shame. And I say this a lot as someone who is an educator, and I just see the way that AI is talked about in education. And it's like, you know, let's think about this. Even when it comes to researchers too, I don't want to only talk about the students. There's a lot of reports coming out about scholars that have produced AI generated research reports with fake citations, right? So, yes, obviously they should be cite checking their work and that should have never been submitted. But guess why? Guess what? So much of that was able to happen because look at the incentives. Why did we give people the pressure of publish and perish? You can't get tenure or job security unless you publish at inhumane rates on very little salary with no economic incentives, right? I remember when I was doing research to publish my first AI research paper, the cost of submitting an academic paper. I'm sorry, in the humanities, we don't have that cost. So I kept asking my STEM friends, I said, who's paying this? Who is paying these academic journals? For you to publish something I wrote, $2,500, $2,500, and thank God, you know, um, I'm not under the same publish or perish system that a lot of academics are in. Um, and when you think about reviewing these actual articles, right? How many overworked academics actually have time to go through every citation and check it, right? And I'm not saying that, um, these things should have happened and it's okay. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we have to be cognizant of these systemic issues that allowed for these things to happen, right? Um, and third, I just want to say that at the systemic level, I truly believe a lot of the energy should be directed towards advocating for better incentives as opposed to yelling at every single person you see on social media using generative AI. Um, I think if you're an educator, you can design assignments that reward thinking, not just outputs. If you're a manager, you can create work cultures that value depth and protect deep thinking and deep work and focus time, right? Um, if you're a citizen, you can support policies. I'm a huge advocate for that. You can support policies that make mental health care accessible and rebuilds community infrastructure and, holds AI companies accountable for how they're building out these data centers and how they're engaging with communities and the resources that they're relying on, especially at the local level. If you're in the United States and federal legislation is at a stall, there's still a lot you can do locally. Um, and you can vote with your attention, your money, your voice, right? Like that. Those are options. I'm not saying you don't have options. You can't do anything, right? Um, so essentially, I don't think the question is why are people using AI this way, right? I think more so we need to shift ourselves over to asking, um, what? Let me say it like this: the real question I think at play is this: what broken incentives made this specific action that you are critiquing or that you want to pass moral judgment on attractive in the first place? And once you ask that question, I think, we can actually get to the point where we're fixing things and actually enacting change on the systems that are being created and shaped right now. Not by blaming individuals who, in my opinion, are responding rationally to irrational systems, um, but looking at ways we can just redesign these systems altogether, right? Um, so yeah, that's my argument. I think generative AI is exposing what we already know is broken. Once again, the attention economy was already hijacking our brains. Education was already optimizing for credentials over learning. Um, as I've stated, the social infrastructure was already collapsing. um, and work was already drowning us in admin. Like, come on, nobody wants to, check Slack at 10 p.m. at night, right? AI didn't do that, right? The systems and infrastructures we created did, right? And look, I think that's actually good news because it means, there's a lot of work that we can do, right? We can build better incentives. We can redesign structures that actually serve human flourishing instead of just optimizing for metrics that just like won't matter in the future, right? Um, but I think all this really hinges on us, not blaming individuals, but really starting to examine the systems that we've built. And I think, yeah, ultimately that's where the real work is. And, you have agency. Um, so yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on this, and how we can think about reshaping and redesigning and rebuilding a lot of these systems that I was talking about. So, yeah, thanks for listening. If this resonated with you, I would love to hear more from you. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, my newsletter, wherever you're listening to this. And that's all in the description box and the show notes. And yeah, if you want to go deeper on this, you can always check out my reading list that I curated for you over on my newsletter. And yeah, you guys are some smart nerds. I love the responses I always get to these voice notes because you are thinking critically, and that's all I can ever ask for.